Good day, everyone. This will be the discussion of the development finance. But before we talk about money and taxes, let's first understand what is it we're trying to finance, or in short, what do we mean by development? When you hear the word development, what comes to your mind? Is it malls, skyscrapers, more factories, or is it free healthcare, quality education, clean air? Well, the point here is our understanding of development has changed over time, and that change directly affects how governments plan and finance national progress. Let's start with how it all began. Back in the mid 20th century, development has mainly seen as economic growth. The idea was simple. If a country's economy is growing, if it's producing more goods, building more infrastructures, and increasing its GDP, it is developing. GDP, or the gross domestic product, became the standard measure. If your GDP was increasing, you were considered successful. This idea was backed by economists like Walter Rostow, who created a famous theory called the stages of economic growth. According to Rostow, all countries start as traditional societies. Then they build a foundation for growth. Eventually, they take off economically, and finally, they become mature and consumer driven like the West. Rostow's idea was, if you follow the same path as Western industrialized countries, you will develop too. But many countries increased their GDP but remained poor in other ways. Like people still lack access to education, poverty remained high, healthcare was poor, the richer got richer and the poor got left behind. So economists start asking, is GDP enough to say that a country is developed? Well, in response, the structuralist school of thought emerged. Structuralists said it is not enough to just grow your economy. You have to fix the deep internal problems first. They believe developing countries had structural weaknesses like over-dependence on agriculture, unfair land distribution, lack of industries, poor infrastructure. So what's the solution? Governments should actively intervene, invest in factories and roads, support local and industries, create jobs through public projects. So, for example, if a country is sick, the government needs to act like a doctor. It must diagnose the problems and prescribe the right treatment. Then came more radical critique, the dependency theory. Dependency theorists said, wait a minute, developing countries aren't just poor, they're being kept poor. Why? Because they are dependent on rich countries. They export cheap materials, they import expensive manufactured goods, and they borrow money from rich lenders. The result? A cycle of dependence where global south stays poor and the global north continues to benefit. So they called for self-reliance, which is to protect local industries, reduce imports, and avoid relying too much on foreign loans. So in essence, they believed that the global economic system was unfair and real development required breaking free from the system. By the 1980s, another shift happened. This was the rise of neoliberalism. Neoliberals believed government is the problem, that markets take care of development. So they pushed for privatizing state-owned companies, reducing government spending, and opening markets for trade and foreign investment. Institutions like IMF and World Bank promote this model through structural adjustment programs or SAP. In theory, it sounded efficient, but in practice, many public services were cut, prices of goods went up, and poverty increased in some countries. So again, people started asking, is this the kind of development we want? Well, eventually, the world realized that development is not just economic, it's also social and environmental. That's where human development was introduced by Amartya Sen came in. It emphasized expanding human freedoms, providing more choices, and improving the quality of life. This led to the creation of the Human Development Index, which will be tackled later. Soon after, the idea of sustainable development emerged, highlighting the need to protect the planet, promote equity, and think about future generations. So what do we mean by sustainable? Sustainability means being able to meet our needs today without harming the ability of future generations to meet theirs. This idea became popular in the late 1980s after the Brundtland Report from the United Nations. Why? Because the world started to notice a disturbing pattern. Forests were disappearing, air and water were getting polluted, climate change was becoming more real, and some countries were getting richer, others were falling behind. So economists, environmentalists, and policymakers asked, is this really development if it destroys our environment and leaves so many people behind? Sustainable development was introduced to fix that imbalance. Sustainable development stands on these three interrelated pillars. First is the economic sustainability, which is making sure the economy grows in a way that's stable, efficient, and mindful of future costs. For example, promoting green industries, local businesses, and long-term investments, not just quick profit. Second is the social sustainability, which ensures fairness, justice, and equal access to opportunities for all people. For example, is making sure rural communities also get schools, hospitals, and clean water, not just the urban areas. And the third is the environmental sustainability, in which protecting our natural resources and reducing pollution and carbon emissions. Example is investing in renewable energy instead of coal, protecting forests, and regulating industries. You can remember these three as planet, people, and profit balanced together. Let's apply this to our country. Economic growth in the Philippines is strong in terms of GDP, but we also face widening inequality where the rich benefit more than the poor. At the same time, we face serious environmental threats from typhoons, floods, and deforestation. So the challenge is, how do we grow without destroying our environment? And how do we make sure that growth benefits everyone, not just the wealthy few? That's where sustainable development becomes more than just a theory. It becomes a guiding principle for policymaking and budgeting. Now let's talk about how we measure development. Earlier we said GDP measures how much we produce but not how we live. So the UNDP, or the United Nations Development Programme, introduced the Human Development Index. It measures the development in three important areas. First is health, the life expectancy at birth. It is how long do people live, or are they healthy? Second is education. It is the average years of schooling and expected years of schooling. So are the people going to school? Are they learning? So third is standard of living, or it is the gross national income per capita. So do people earn enough to afford basic needs? So HDI gives us a fuller picture. Two countries might have the same GDP, but one may have a better education and healthcare. That country would have a higher HDI. So why is HDI a better measurement than GDP alone? Well, it puts people, not just production, at the center of development. If we adopt sustainable development as our goal, then our fiscal policy, or how the government collects and spends money, must reflect that. What does that look like? First, sustainable fiscal policy must be pro-poor. That means the government should allocate a big portion of its budget to programs that benefit the poor and vulnerable. Examples are free or subsidized healthcare and education, social protection programs like 4Ps, and housing projects for informal settlers. In short, we need to invest in people, especially those who are usually left behind, like farmers, indigenous communities, or those living in rural areas. Second is environmental accountability. The budget must consider the environment. This means introducing policies that protect natural resources and reduce pollution. What can governments do? Impose eco taxes on plastics, fuel or pollution-heavy industries provide incentives to businesses that go green, like those using solar panels or electric vehicles, and use green bonds to fund climate-resilient infrastructure like flood control or renewable energy. This is called environmental fiscal reform, where the government uses its taxing and spending power to help save the planet. Third, the government must be careful about borrowing. Yes, borrowing can help finance big projects, but only if it's done wisely and responsibly. Here's the rule: don't borrow for wasteful or short term expenses. Borrow for things that will provide long term benefits like roads, schools, or renewable energy infrastructure. Also, make sure that future generations are not burdened with debt from today's irresponsible spending. That's called intergenerational equity, a key principle of sustainable development. I will give you a simple analogy. So let's imagine you have 1,000 pesos. You can first, option one, spend it all on junk food today, which is cheap satisfaction but no long-term value. Option two, buy a book and healthy food. It is good for your learning and well-being. Or option three, use it as a capital for a small business. It grows and gives you returns later. The sustainable development is like third option. You use your money wisely, invest in long-term growth, and leave something better for our future. So how do government finance development? Development finance refers to the mobilization of resources through taxation, non-tax revenues, grants, and borrowing to fund programs and projects that contribute to a country's economic and social progress. But to understand development finance properly, we need to start with a powerful tool in government planning: fiscal policy. The fiscal policy is how the government collects money or revenue and spends it to influence the economy. This includes taxation, public spending, borrowing, and it plays three key roles and functions in the development. First is allocation function. This function is about how the government allocates resources to produce goods and services, especially public goods. What are these public goods? Is the roads, schools, streetlights, and clean air. The public goods are the things everyone benefits from, but the private sector has little incentive to produce because they are non-profitable. For example, the roads and bridges in rural areas, free education in public schools, and mass vaccination programs. The allocation function ensures that the government funds services that the private sector won't, especially those that serve the poor and protect the environment. This is crucial for sustainable and inclusive development. Second is the distribution function. So this deals with correcting inequalities. Left alone, the free market tends to favor the rich. So the government steps in to redistribute income using tools like the progressive taxation, in which taxing the rich more. Next is subsidies for the poor and social protection programs like 4P. So why is this important in development finance? Because growth without equity creates tension and unrest. Development is only meaningful if its benefits reach everyone, especially the marginalized. So when the government uses fiscal policy to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor, it fulfills its distribution role. Third is stabilization function. So finally, fiscal policy helps stabilize the economy. It acts like a shock absorber. For example, during the recession like COVID-19, the government increases spending and reduces taxes to boost demand. During inflation, it may reduce spending or increase taxes to slow down the economy and stabilize prices. This function is especially important in developing countries like the Philippines, where economy is often vulnerable to natural disasters, global shocks, and local political changes. A stable economy is necessary for consistent long-term development. Now that we know what fiscal policy does, let's go into specific ways governments raise money for development. There are four major strategies. First is the role of taxation. Taxation is the primary and the most consistent source of government revenue. But taxation is the lifeblood of the country. So there are two main types of taxation, in which the first is direct taxes. So these are the taxes on income and wealth. For example, the personal income tax, which is based on how much a person earns. Corporate income tax are taxes on business profits, and capital gains on profits from selling assets. So why is this important? Direct taxes are progressive, meaning they can be designed so that higher earners pay more, helping reduce inequality. Second is indirect taxes. So these are taxes on goods and services. For example, the value added tax or the VAT on almost everything we buy. The excise tax, which is on alcohol, cigarettes, sugary drinks, which is also called as sin taxes. Custom duties, taxes on imported goods. Some taxes, like the sin taxes, are used to discourage harmful behavior while generating funds. What are the challenges in taxation? First is tax evasion and corruption lower revenue. Next is narrow tax base in which too many people are outside the formal economy. And weak enforcement makes tax collection inefficient. In the Philippines, improving tax compliance and expanding the base are ongoing battles. The second strategy is the non-tax revenue. So this is the income government earns outside of taxes. It includes the service fees like the licensing and permit fees, dividends from government-owned and controlled corporations, fines and penalties, or the royalties from mining, oil, and the natural resources. So why does it matter? Non-tax revenue is often underutilized. Poor management, corruption, and inefficiencies in state-owned enterprises result in lost revenue. Improving non-tax collection is a key strategy to reduce borrowing and finance development sustainability. Third strategy is the grants from multilateral and bilateral partners. So sometimes governments receive financial assistance in the form of grants. These do not need to be repaid unlike loans. Multilateral grants come from organizations like World Bank, Asian Development Bank, United Nations Development Programs or the UNDP. Bilateral grants come from individual countries like Japan or the JICA, United States or the USAID, and European Union or the EU assistance. Its benefits are to help fund health, education, disaster response, etc., build institutional capacity. But the caution is, some grants come with conditions that may limit policy independence. For example, a grant might require the recipient to adopt a certain policy or open a sector to foreign investment. Fourth strategy is borrowing. So when the tax and non-revenues are not enough, governments borrow to fund development. This includes domestic borrowing, which is issuing government bonds or treasury bills, borrowing from local banks or institutions. Second is the internal borrowing, which is taking loans from World Bank, ADB, IMF, foreign governments, and global capital markets. So, why borrowing can be good? Because it allows governments to build major infrastructure like bridges and airports, even when they don't have cash now. But why is this risky? Borrowing increases public debt. Interest payments may consume future budgets. If foreign currency is used, currency devaluation makes repayment harder. Borrowing is not bad, but it must be done strategically and responsibly, ensuring projects bring long-term benefits. All these strategies, taxes, non-tax revenues, grants, and borrowing are tools that the government uses to raise money. But what matters the most is how well they're managed, how equitable they're used, and how they align with national development goals. Good development finance is equal to revenue generation plus responsible spending plus sustainability. Now let's look at how development financing is evolving in response to the demands of the 21st century. Why do we need new financing models? Because development challenges are getting more complex. Climate change, digital transformation, rising inequality, and etc. Because traditional funding sources like taxes and foreign aid are often not enough or not sustainable, and because private capital must now play a bigger role in supporting public goals. This is where emerging financing concepts come in. These are innovative ways of funding projects that aim to be financially viable while also delivering social and environmental impact. Blended finance is a strategy that uses public or philanthropic money to attract private investments in development projects. How does it work? The government or a donor provides guarantees or takes first loss position, or they absorb the earlier risk. This gives private investors the confidence to put money into development sectors that they would normally avoid, like agriculture, education, or rural infrastructure. For example, in the Philippines, blended finance can be used to fund renewable energy projects, support MSMEs in rural areas, build climate resilient infrastructure in vulnerable provinces. So it matters because it helps unlock billions in private capital that would otherwise never go to development needs. Green bonds are a type of government and corporate bond where the money raised is used exclusively for environmental sustainable projects. For example, of what they can fund is solar or wind farms, mass transport systems that reduce carbon emission, reforestation programs, and flood control and climate resilient projects. So what's different from regular bonds? So projects are certified green and the investors are assured that their money contributes to environmental goals. Climate finance more broadly refers to all financing, public and private, that goes toward mitigating or adapting to climate change. Well, it matters because in a country like Philippines that faces typhoons, floods, and rising sea levels, green and climate finance is essential for survival. Impact investing is when investors intentionally seek both financial return and positive social or environmental outcomes. Think of it as a middle ground between charity, in which it expects no return, and traditional investing, which only cares about profit. Examples of impact investing are funding companies that provide clean water to poor communities, supporting agri-tech startups that help small farmers, and financing low-cost housing projects. So this encourages private capital to address social problems directly instead of just chasing profits. Next is public-private partnerships or PPP. PPPs are collaborations between the government and the private companies to build infrastructure or deliver public services. The private sector brings in capital and expertise, and the government provides policy support and regulatory frameworks. For example, is the MRT and LRT systems, the water services, and the toll roads and expressways. Its advantages includes reduce of government's financial burden and tap into private sector innovation. The risks are if not managed well, PPPs can lead to price increases, service inequality, or corruption. That's why transparency and strong regulations are key in PPP. Next is digital financial inclusion and fintech. So this refers to the use of technology to provide financial services to people who are traditionally excluded, like the unbanked poor, farmers, or small entrepreneurs. For example, is the GCash and Maya as digital wallets, mobile microloans for business, and blockchain for transparent fund transfer in government aid. So this increases the tax collection as more people join the formal economy. It also improves government services delivery like the DSWD payout. It also reduces corruption and leakage in fund disbursement. Next is sovereign wealth funds and development funds. So some countries create sovereign or development funds, like large pools of capital invested by the state in profitable ventures, with the earnings used for long-term development. In instance, like in the Philippines, the recently proposed Maharlika Investment Fund aims to be a kind of sovereign wealth fund, but it has sparked debates over governance, transparency, and fiscal priorities. So, if managed well, these funds can be a stable source of revenue for development. If misused, they can become a source of corruption and economic instability. Next is results-based and outcome-based financing. So instead of funding input like building schools, the government or donors only pay when specific results or outcomes are achieved. For example, paying a contractor only when students' test scores improve, releasing funds when maternal mortality rates decrease. So this promotes efficiency, innovation, and accountability. So why are these emerging concepts are important? Because traditional finance is no longer enough to meet sustainable development goals or the SDGs and build a resilient economy. Countries need to mobilize more capital, reduce risk for investors, and ensure that growth is not just fast, but fair, green, and inclusive. These new tools are designed not just to build more, but to build better. So emerging development finance tools offer new ways to solve old problems. They make financing more inclusive, innovative, and impact-driven. They also require strong governance, accountability, and public participation to succeed. So far, we've been looking at development finance as a tool to improve lives, reduce poverty, and build a better future. But here's a reality check. Financing development also comes with risks, trade-offs, and serious consequences if misused. Here are the world problems that governments face and what they can do about it. First is price development. So what is price development? Well, can development be harmful? It can be when it comes with hidden costs that harm the environment, displace communities, or cause economic problems. That's why this issue is called what price development. Development often leads to environmental degradation, a concept that refers to the damage or depletion of natural resources. Examples include deforestation for roads or large farms, pollution from factories, and loss of biodiversity due to mining and infrastructure. So yes, development helps the economy, but at what cost to nature? This is what we call the sustainability trade-off, gaining growth now but risking the health of future generations. Solution: government must use green financing like green bonds for climate projects, require environmental impact assessments before approving big projects. Now let's talk about the social side. Development may help a country overall, but not everyone benefits equally. This creates social inequality. Well, what happens? Projects help urban elites but leave rural areas behind, where families are displaced from their homes due to gentrification or large construction projects. Indigenous communities are forced out with little compensation. For example, large dams or mining operations that relocate people with no clear livelihood replacement. So the solutions include implement inclusive development policies and require social safeguards to protect vulnerable groups during big projects. Let's move on to debt. Development is often funded through borrowing. That's fine if it's done responsibly, but when countries borrow too much, they face a debt burden. This would result to debt accumulation when borrowing adds up over time and debt overhang in which when future income is used mainly to pay debt instead of funding services. So what's the problem? Debt servicing or repaying loans take a big chunk of the budget, leaving little for health, education, or housing. The solution is only borrow for productive projects like infrastructure education, and rely more on concessional loans, which are those with low interest, and improve domestic revenue generation. Next is inflationary pressure. So let's imagine a country keeps spending, borrowing, or printing money. What happens to prices? Well, inflation happens. Inflation means the general rise in prices, which reduces purchasing power, especially for the poor. Development spending can trigger inflation if it's funded by deficit financing. Too much money is pushed into the economy without proper control. Solution would be coordinate with the central bank for inflation control, avoid overspending through strict fiscal discipline, and use targeted subsidies instead of across-the-board spending. Let's move on to the next big issue in the development finance, the relationship between development and stability. We often hear this: development brings peace, more jobs, better roads, higher income. That's stability, right? Well, yes, in theory, development should reduce poverty, lessen inequality, and lead to more peaceful society. But here's the problem. This isn't always what happens in reality. So what does mirage mean? A mirage is an illusion, something that looks real or promising from a distance but disappears when you get closer. So when we say development and stability a mirage, we're asking, is the stability we expect from development sometimes just an illusion? Well, it sounds ironic, but yes, that's why we call this issue a mirage, because sometimes development creates more problems than it solves. So economically, it happens when the countries borrow too much, rely on unstable exports, or face currency devaluation, or when the local currency loses value. Example, if we borrow in US dollars, the peso weakens, we suddenly owe more pesos than expected. Also, the boom and bust cycles happen when economies depend too much on commodities like oil and sugar. Prices rise, then crash. The solution? Diversify the economy, limit risky external borrowing, and monitor foreign exchange and interest rate risk. For political instability, people protest when they feel left out. The common triggers are unequal development, corruption in infrastructure funding, and misuse of public money. The solution will be practice good governance, ensure public finance transparency, and strengthen anti-corruption laws and institutions. Let's now talk about money the government earns outside of taxes. This is called the non-tax revenues. For example, the regulatory fees or the licenses and permits, dividends from state-owned corporations, royalties from mining, fines and penalties. But many countries neglect this area. They either don't collect properly or state firms are mismanaged. The problem? Lost income, more borrowing, more taxes. And the solution would be modernize collection systems, audit and reform government-owned and controlled corporations, and improve monitoring and enforcement. Non-tax revenue can be a changer if used well. Borrowing a double-edged sword. Well, we've talked about this, but it's worth repeating. Borrowing can build nations or break them. So if borrowing becomes uncontrolled, you face a debt trap where you borrow more just to repay earlier loans. You lose fiscal space, meaning less flexibility to fund priorities, and you suffer from interest rate and currency risk. Example will be some developing countries spend over 30% or 40% of their budgets on debt repayment alone. Well, the solution would be borrow only for essential high return projects, use medium term debt management strategies, and favor grants and concessional loans. Then fiscal space reduction. Fiscal space means room in the budget spent. If too much of your budget goes to paying debt, there's less space for schools, hospitals, or disaster response. While the solution would be to improve tax collection, increase non-tax revenues, and reassess spending priorities and reduce waste. So how do we avoid borrowing recklessly? We should enforce fiscal responsibility laws, improve transparency by publishing public debt reports, involve citizens in budget planning. This promotes intergenerational equity, a term meaning we must protect the ability of future generations to meet their needs. To conclude our discussion, we've seen that financing development is about much more than just collecting taxes or borrowing money. It is about mobilizing and managing public resources in a way that promotes inclusive growth, social equity, and long-term sustainability. We started by understanding how the concept of development has evolved from focusing purely on economic growth to embracing human development and sustainability. This shift changes what we prioritize in our budget, not just factories and roads, but education, healthcare, green energy, and social protection. We explored how governments use fiscal policy to fund these priorities through taxation, non-tax revenues, grants, and borrowing. Each strategy has strengths but also risks. Borrowing can fund important projects, but it can also lead to debt traps. Taxes can reduce inequality, but they must be collected fairly and efficiently. We also tackled the emerging tools like green bonds, blended finance, and impact investing, which show that public finance must now adopt the modern challenges like climate change and digital transformation. But perhaps most importantly, we examine the real world problems. When development finance is misused, it can cause inflation, deepen inequality, and even destabilize economies and governments. It becomes a mirage, an illusion of progress that hides long-term damage. In the end, development finance is not just a technical or economic issue. It is a reflection of our values. It asks us, who do we want to help? What kind of future are we building? And how do we make sure that no one is left behind? Good development finance is just inclusive, transparent, and sustainable. That is the kind of financing that truly supports real, lasting development.